Kitchener Centre.
Speaker, rising this afternoon to have an opportunity, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with respect to some reflections on the speech from the throne. And as I do so, what I'd like to focus on are priorities where there's an opportunity to be working constructively with the governing party, and in fact with all parliamentarians, to make progress on priorities that this government has put forward in the speech from the throne and that I've heard time and again from folks in my community in Kitchener. I'd like to start with housing, first of all. In the speech from the throne, the governing party speaks about being committed to working with partners to get real results. Well, I want to start with what it looks like in my community. In the last year, we did a study on the number of unsheltered folks. It's now risen to over 1,000 people living rough unsheltered, 3 times as much as the last point of count study. When we look at those who are looking to purchase a home, back in 2005, the cost of purchasing a home in Kitchener was 3 times higher than median annual income. In 2021, that rose to 8.6 times higher, as the possibility of purchasing a home, as is, I know, the case for so many others across the country, increasingly just completely out of reach. For those on the wait list to get access to affordable, dignified housing, that wait list now is upwards of almost 8 years. Can you imagine waiting 8 years to get access to housing? And some folks, I spoke with a woman this past summer, said, she was lucky that she got access to affordable housing, but there's mold in her unit. And she knows that her landlord has no incentive to do anything about it. So we need to both be addressing not just the affordability, but the quality of dignified housing. Homes should be for people to live in, as opposed to commodities for investors to trade. And to do that, we're going to need to address the rules of the game. For example, getting back to investing in non-market subsidized and public and co-op housing. Back in the early 80s, for example, 8% of new rental units constructed were co-op housing. I lived in a co-op myself over many years and have that experience of what quality and dignified housing co-ops can be. Well, look at 2020, where less than 1% of rental units constructed were co-op housing. We could look at taxation. For example, investors who are merely purchasing a property to speculate and take many years to eventually flip a home, we could put in place a graduated tax on those house flippers and use the revenue to reinvest in more affordable housing. We could be looking at what BMO is also called for, putting an end to the blind bidding process. I look forward to working with the government to make progress, meaningful progress, on addressing the cost of housing. In the throne speech, there was also talk of addressing the cost of living, and made reference to the Canada Child Benefit and to addressing childcare. And while I celebrate those, we need to also recognize a group of Canadians who are disproportionately living in poverty, and that's Canadians living with disabilities. In fact, the word disability wasn't in the throne speech once at all. And we know that the governing party has previously introduced the Canada Disability Benefit. This benefit would lift up to 1.5 million Canadians who are currently living in poverty. And we know that Canadians across the country support it. 89% of Canadians already support the Canada Disability Benefit. Back in Kitchener, for folks with disabilities who are getting access to the Ontario Disability Support Program, the shelter allowance they're receiving is $497 a month. How many apartments could someone afford in Kitchener on $497 a month? None whatsoever. This is why we need to be focused on a moral imperative to lift up Canadians living with disabilities and ensure that they have access to a dignified life across the country. Next, with respect to mental health, in the throne speech, there's talk of a focus on mental health in the same way as physical well-being because they're inseparable. I could not agree more. There is a shadow pandemic we're in the midst of with respect to mental health, and this is why we need to see increased commitments to mental health funding while recognizing the overdose crisis we're in the midst of as a result of a poison drug supply. In Kitchener, we had 99 preventable deaths across Waterloo Region last year alone. It was the second highest. We have groups like including the Canadian Chiefs of Police, who are making very clear calls for the need to decriminalize simple possession, while also working towards a safer supply. These are the policies that aren't mentioned in the throne speech that I would encourage the governing party to consider, recognizing the shared interest in making progress on mental health and addictions and saving lives across the country. Which brings me to the final point, to echo some comments we heard earlier from the honourable member from Saanich Gulf Islands with respect to addressing the climate crisis. To simply follow the science, that we are past time for talking about whether your plan is better than another party's plan, because the fact is that doesn't matter. All that matters is whether we choose to hold on to the possibility of keeping the potential for a maximum increase of a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures. And this is true for people across my community, young and old, who are together saying enough is enough. That we have a moral imperative to ensure we provide a safe climate future for our kids, our nieces, our nephews, and our grandkids. In the words of Greta Thunberg, I'll share again, either we do it or we don't. Either we prevent a 1.5 degree of warming or we don't. Either we choose to go on as a civilization or we don't. We have that opportunity today. And so we could be looking to say, maybe this isn't the right time to be investing $18 billion in subsidies to fossil fuels, or to be purchasing and expanding a pipeline to further export more emissions around the world, and instead use those same funds. The funds that just last month that were announced for an emissions reduction fund that actually increased oil production, or this new tax credit being talked about for carbon capture and storage, each one of which is just another subsidy to fossil fuel interests that we could be repurposing and making that choice to invest in a just transition for workers on the front lines, that we could be using to build on the comments earlier with respect to the Canada Green Homes Grant. Great, $5,000 a month is a great start. Let's retrofit every building in the country and create millions of jobs as we do it. To take the kind of action that we all know is required if we're going to be honest about the science and follow through. And so in closing, that is my aspiration, is to continue to work with all parliamentarians in this place, recognizing we have that shared interest in listening to folks in our communities who are calling out to rise past the partisanship, rise past whatever one party is called for versus another, and to simply be honest about what scientists and young people and Indigenous leaders have been calling out for, whether that relates to, as I mentioned earlier, the cost of housing, whether it relates to addressing the mental health crisis that we're in, whether it relates to lifting up folks out of poverty or addressing the climate crisis, not just to do some good, but to go at the pace that scientists tell us is required. Thank you.
Questions and comments.
The Honourable Député de...
The Honourable Member for Beauport-Limoilou. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll go back a bit to the beginning of my colleague's speech with respect to social housing. Yes, there is a serious lack of housing, not only affordable housing, but also economically viable for most families. I'm not sure what the case is in his riding, but I know in my riding there are sometimes foreign companies that build condos that cost $2,500 a month, which isn't affordable. Even with a 10% rebate, that's not viable. So what are his options for solutions so that we can really offer something to our young people that is lasting, sustainable, and truly affordable? Thank you. The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Merci bien.
Thank you very much for that question from my colleague from Beauport-Limoilou. It's an important one.
Just right. Because it's so important that we talk about not only the investments, but the policies that are required, not just for affordable, but dignified and quality housing. And so I'd look forward to a longer conversation with herself and other colleagues to talk not only about the investments, but the policies that are required. I mentioned some on taxation, for example. I mentioned co-op housing, other options around public and subsidized housing to ensure that they're truly affordable and dignified as well. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for Kitchener Centre for his focus on climate and housing in his speech. I certainly hear from folks in Elmwood Transcona who are struggling to access housing that's within their budget, and I'm also hearing from not just people who are struggling at the poverty line who can't find housing, but I'm hearing from folks who in their time with a good middle-class job are able to afford a home for their family, but are really unable to imagine how it is that their children are going to be able to afford a home. So I'm wondering if the member can speak a little bit to some of the actions that the government could take to try and cool the housing market. Some even were in their own platform, but we haven't seen them moving on with a sense of urgency so far in this parliament. And then also I wonder, it's clear we do need a massive investment, not just in affordable housing, which too often that definition puts housing still out of reach for people. We need rent geared to income housing. And I'm wondering about how we could use a major capital campaign to build those units, but to do it in a way that is responsive to the climate crisis and ensuring that we're doing that in a way that creates the most possible housing within reach for people who need it, in a way that creates the least possible emissions. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
Well, thanks to the honourable member from Elmwood Transcona for the question. Let me also thank him for his advocacy in this place for seniors in particular, because the questions he's asking around housing, so often it's the case, I didn't have a chance to mention it in my speech, but it's seniors across the country who are living often below the poverty line, who are often looking at the rising cost of housing and saying, and the anxiety that comes with recognizing whether they'll be able to continue to afford housing in the places in which they live. And so one example to the policies that the member was asking about that the government has talked about is a vacancy tax. That we could put in place a meaningful tax on homes that are purchased by investors with no interest in anyone ever living there. And while the government has talked about a 1% tax on non-resident, non-Canadians, we have examples across the country, in Vancouver, for example, where it's far broader. And that kind of a measure, again, could use those funds to reinvest. To the point around climate, another opportunity when it comes to no-interest loans to ensure that low-income Canadians have access to the funding required for the energy upgrades to reduce the energy poverty across the country as well.
Now we have time for a quick snapper, as we'd say it out east. The honourable member for Sonia Lambton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite for covering so many great topics in his speech. I want to talk about affordable housing because in Sarnia we have an affordable housing crisis, and because of the lack of action on the part of the Liberals, we're now seeing an increase in homelessness. And I wondered if he could comment on what that's like in his riding. Is he seeing the same thing?
The member for Kitchener Centre.
It is devastating, the tripling in the number of people in my community back in Waterloo region who are living rough, who are living unsheltered, and the variety of ways that they are impacted not only with respect to housing, but when it comes to mental health as well. And I look forward to working with the honourable member to address the reality of the Canadians living across the country without access to safe and quality housing. Thank you.
Continuing debate, reprise du débat, the honourable member for